Okay, why don't we get started? We'll have a few more folks joining us, but let's get going. And we're also waiting for Kelvin. So, today is Sunday before Memorial Day, which is celebrated in every part of America, honoring those who have fallen. And what we felt was apt was to actually change topic slightly for today. And as part of our wellness series, let's focus and deep dive into some spiritual values. And as part of this reality check with Rishi, we have had many types of discussions. We talk about technology. We talk about stimulus packages and how it could help businesses. We have had many healthcare panel discussions, town hall meetings, which has been actively engaging with our community to answer some of the most compelling questions about coronavirus. And what we just did earlier at 2 p.m., we were actually helping out our folks who are looking for opportunities in the job industry because unfortunately, with the economic impact, there have been layoffs. So this is a weekly activity for us at 2 p.m. We actually talk about the changing landscape of the economy and the opportunities that might exist for all of us. So we actually had a Silicon Valley leader, an executive who was talking about product management and how it could be a lucrative career and some of the different options around there. So this is something that sort of brings us all together to have a dialogue on the issues of the time and to also lead to a very engaging conversation. And so our objective is to talk a little bit about, we have a very special guest here today, and we'll just peel the onion in terms of, how exactly spiritual quest aligns with what we do in the real world. And do they really intersect? Does it have to be one or the other? But also we'll learn from an expert on this topic who's written many books. So with that, let's introduce Debashish Banerjee. He is a man of many talents. So let's talk about his stint as a teacher, as a professor. So Debashish is the Haridas Chaudhary Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures and the Doshi Professor of Asian Art at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's also the program chair for the East-West Psychology Department. And prior to CIIS, he served as Professor of Indian Studies and Dean of Academics at the University of Philosophical Research in Los Angeles. And he made the journey from Southern California to Northern California, and he's a little closer to us here. And he's also taught as the adjunct faculty at the Pasadena City College, UCLA, and UC Irvine. So he's obviously has a very good track record as a teacher, professor, and as an author. He has he has authored and edited several books on major figures of the Bengal Renaissance, such as the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore and artist Abanindranath Tagore and the spiritual thinker Sri Aurobindo. And we'll dig a little bit deeper with Aurobindo today, and we'll talk about Aurobindo and his teachings because that has been a core foundation of what Debashish has been writing about. And when I was doing initial reading about him, he is obviously well regarded, and many of his YouTube videos have thousands and thousands of hits. And his philosophies, his perspectives are obviously very well respected, but also a source of great information. So his most recent authored books are like the 7 Quartets of Becoming a Transformational Yoga Psychology, based on the diaries of Sri Aurobindo, and Meditations on the Isha Upanishad, tracing the philosophical vision of Sri Aurobindo. He has also edited books on critical posthumanism and integral yoga psychology. So, if you look at, a man of many talents and many interests, And if you summarize his interests, they lie in the postmodern, post-colonial, and cross-cultural approaches to Indian philosophy, psychology, and culture. And he has also curated a number of exhibitions of Indian and Japanese art. So it's a delight to present to you Debashish Banerjee as a devotee and yoga and a seeker. And let's get the conversation started. Debashish, it's a pleasure. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Rishi. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's get the conversation started. And the very first thing I would love to ask you, Debashish, is, we touched upon that, my spiritual journey actually, which is probably the most important aspect of my life. People look at me as a high-tech worker, as a community leader, or perhaps a political leader. But the spiritual journey, the spiritual quest is first and foremost in my life. And it actually started very young, reading the autobiography of a yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda, and he deeply inspired me to pursue this path and to make it a priority. We can get very busy with all the things that we do, but at the same time, there are things that deserve importance, and I've tried to do that, even if I'm very busy. But it sort of has kept me very grounded in terms of focusing on things that are of importance. And that also includes like Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and also Ramana Maharishi. I've gone to Arunachala many times. And, the spiritual journey is definitely a path, I believe, which is taking me into an inner transformation. And it's hopefully a good story happening. A spiritual quest and a worldly living is a tough mix, but I seemingly try to practice that. And but this is something that many folks struggle with. For example, one of my dear friends talks about being trapped in a COVID-19 world and how he has forced himself into a situation where he can sort of, and to some extent, he has actually contrived that situation for himself so that he can practice and function, not only take care of his day job, but also build his practice and go through a meditation. And let me leave it there. So I think we are conflicted to some way, and can this coexist as we progress spiritually? How do we discern different spiritual teachings, but also how do we sort of align and bring it all together? So would you say that your spiritual path and the worldly path have converged for you? So a variety of different questions, but let's get this conversation started. And the format is, typically I sort of run the moderation, but I have some amazing folks who have joined here today. So I would like to have all of them jump in and participate actively in this conversation, including Rishi Yadav, including Sudhakar, including Kelvin. Kelvin has probably dialed in. So with that, Debashish, thank you again. So let's get it started.
Thanks, Rishi. And I think that's a really a very powerful issue, what you've brought up regarding spirituality and work life, working in the world. And you asked me whether I feel that these two lives have converged for me. I think they have at this point. And it has been a struggle. It has been a long path. So if I may address the issue of work and life, in the Buddha's Eightfold Path, one of those 8 set of precepts is right living. And it's understood differently by different people. There's one mainstream kind of orthodox view that right living has to be living like a monk. In other words, you can only practice a spiritual life if you leave the world and become a monk. But you have a broader view, which is you can live in any way that is not going to be conflictual with the spiritual life. And so an ethical life, a life that is not going to disturb you ethically from following the spiritual path. And then you see what happens is that what is the borderline becomes a question. And later you find philosophies like Zen Buddhism are actually even pushing it further and saying that any profession, one can be a spiritual person. Like they're talking about great adepts or butchers, somebody who is, adept at cutting a carcass, cutting meat. So the question is, what is a life that converges, a worldly life that converges with spirituality? I think the answer is different for different people based on what kind of spirituality they're trying to follow. I think it has to be something that is ethically aligned with the spiritual life for that person. But I think there's another element as well, which relates to the notion of swadharma, which is coming up in the Bhagavad Gita. And that is it a life that is fulfilling from the inner point of view? Are we engaging our most deepest creative impulses in our work? This may not always be the case because many people are just trying to make a living. And some people are, constrained by various external sources to do what they have to do. But I think if we make those our ideals, if we make our ideal what you exactly said, the convergence of the spiritual and the worldly life, we can undertake a journey which perhaps brings us to that point. And that is, I think, that is part of spirituality itself. And I would like to say that anybody can do that if they're open to that possibility. I can't hear you, Rishi.
Yeah. Very good points. And I just want to add something before Rishi Yadav is planning to jump in. But, essentially, it's a tough balancing act for me. But, my objective of public service is to help millions of people. And that creates a deep, immense joy and happiness in me. And sometimes, I do see the spiritual track falling off the wayside, but I have lots of friends in my life that are constantly there to bring it back together. But also, the universe comes calling and says, okay, Rishi, this is now, you need to do this. And I listen to that inner voice sometimes, or the voice of friends, and I just follow that and create the time for it. It sort of keeps me very grounded, and it keeps me very honest and operating with integrity in this world to sort of make a difference. And with that, let's go to Rishi Yadav.
Yeah, thank you, Rishi Kumar. So Devashish, I mean, the whole topic of the rightful living or the noble living or Samyak Ajivika as we call it, I think that's, even in America, I see that being the biggest challenge, right? Because one of the traits we have as humans is to justify anything and everything, right? That includes factory farming or, all different type of legal professions. Most of them are on the borderline of morality, right? So that's an interesting topic to delve deeper into. But I would let Sudhakar start with his questioning, and then I will chime in. Sudhakar.
Namaste, Debashish ji.
Namaste.
I just came to know about you just an hour ago. Rishi mentioned that I would just see this link. So then I Googled, and then the first thing that came up to my mind was like as children growing up in India, we used to hear Jana Gana Mana Adinayaka Jaya He Bharat Bhagya Vidhata. When you hear that, what comes to your mind?
Well, of course, there is the author of the song was Rabindranath Tagore, but it's also the spiritual, sentiment behind it. That it is a kind of a country which is very diverse, but it is really opening itself to a giver of the destiny of the nation. So there is a opening, as it were, a leading by a divine source that is being acknowledged there. I think that's what comes to me, at least.
So the second instance that happened in my life was when I tried to learn yoga when I was in high school. I saw this beautiful book with a beautiful face that was Paramahamsa Yogananda. So I was reading that book, and then I was so fascinated by that. And then of course the famous Vivekananda and Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. So all these Bengali figures had an immense influence in my life, I'm sure in your life. So if you have to pick one figure from the history, who is the most influencing personality you had in your life?
For me, Sudhakar, it is Sri Aurobindo. I'd say a lot of these people have had a strong impact in my life, and that's why Rishi Kumar mentioned the Bengal Renaissance. That is really my area of focus. I'm very interested in dwelling on that area because I think there are many lessons we still haven't learned that were given at that time, and what solutions they have for us today. So I'd say that entire period was a very fertile period. And of all these figures, the one that has made the deepest impact on me is Sri Aurobindo.
So the title of the book, I think I saw, was The Seven Quatrains of Integral Yoga.
Yeah, it's Seven Quartets of Becoming, a transformational yoga psychology based on the diaries of Sri Aurobindo.
So like, are you talking about the seven chakras, the Kundalini, the process of awakening, or something else?
It's slightly different. Those seven chakras are included there, Sudhakar, but this is a certain approach to yoga that begins with in Sri Aurobindo's life. He started writing diaries about his yoga, and the first pages are contextualization of the yoga that he was following in Sanskrit terms. He calls it Sapta Chatushtaya. Sapta Chatushtaya means seven. Sapta is seven, and Chatushtaya means fours or quarters or quartets. So the seven quartets are seven lines of yoga that he was simultaneously following. And if I may say very quickly, three of them are general practices, and four of them are supportive practices for these three. And I would like to kind of just encapsulate it through one shloka of the Bhagavad Gita that I'm sure all of you have heard, and everybody, many people, Indians have heard. It is a shloka that goes, Brahmarpadam, Brahmahavir, Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahma karma samadhina. So in this hymn is very popular. People use it before they eat. It's like reading the grace in India. But it's a very profound hymn, and it actually contains, I'd say, one of the central messages, if not the central message of the Bhagavad Gita in its last words, which is Brahma karma samadhina. Brahma karma samadhi is by samadhi here is meant the absolute union, the union of Brahman and karma, which goes back to Rishi Kumar's question of spirituality and the worldly life. It is really about, is Brahman working through me? Am I working as an ego, or is Brahman working through me? So this union of Brahma and karma is at the center of the seven quartets. It is Brahma Chatushtaya and Karma Chatushtaya are the central of, and in the center of these two is what he calls Yoga Chatushtaya. So these are the three central limbs of the seven, and the other four are supporting limbs of Brahman and Karma.
So going from the top down, from that Brahma is the one that is eaten, or Brahma is the one who is eating, or everything is Brahma.
Yes.
And then I just step out, and then suddenly the COVID-19 enters this body, and then, oh my God, I'm dying. What is the meaning of life? What happens to me? All that fear that arises in this, what happened to all the top-down knowledge? How does it help or not help?
Well, it certainly helps. I mean, we have so many questions about our life, what happens in this life, what happens outside this life, what happens in the afterlife. Is there a life beyond this life? So I think, as Krishna says in the Gita, swalpam asya dharmasya, even a little of this dharma, trayate mahato bhayat, takes us beyond the great fear. So, coming into contact with that part of us which is eternal, there is something in us which is eternal. Bhagavad Gita begins with that. It says, you are unborn. All these people you think who are going to kill you and who you are going to kill. I mean, it's analogous to your COVID-19 question. He's in the middle of a great war, a sort of fratricide. And the question is that there is something in us that is untouched. And can we come into contact with that? I mean, whether we'll live or die tomorrow is unknown, but we can certainly come into contact with something in us which is eternal, which outlasts this life and all whatever is going on in this life. This doesn't mean that we have to be irresponsible, but still, that's the first thing that Gita is pointing out, that we should be in contact with that. That is Brahman, the eternal, living in the temporal. And that can be then brought forward into a responsible life.
I read somewhere, maybe this is in the Isha Vyasa Upanishad, that the knowledge of the Dharma helps one to overcome the death, whereas the knowledge of the secular will actually avoid the death. So these two sentences, like how do we actually harmonize these two knowledges in this moment of crisis? Can you elaborate?
Sudhakar, actually, that's a very profound thing what you just said. It's Rishi Kumar pointed out my latest book is on the Isha Upanishad, and what they are saying over there is that there are two kinds of immortality. One is a temporal immortality. In other words, we are reborn. We don't ever die. We come back from life to life. And there's something in us which is eternal, which is reincarnating, the reincarnating soul. Now, of course, there are people who don't believe in that. That's another thing. The point is, can we experience it or not? We can experience it. And there is another kind of eternity that is completely outside the reincarnating self, which is beyond, transcendental. And the Isha Upanishad is saying we can bring the two together. We can make them one, knowing the two as one. But I think what you're pointing out, Sudhakar, is also really important. You're saying secular knowledge brings us how to overcome death in this life. In other words, how we can avoid dying in this life. And I think that's important too. The life is given to us so that we can fulfill it, so that we can express the divine in it. This is the tantric view. The tantric view in India is life affirming. It is not just going outside life to know the transcendent. It's to be creative in this life, to fulfill divine in this life. So I think both are very important.
So let me ask one other question. That is, like my problem seems to be only when I am is present here, right? See, for example, when I think about all the problems I had, I can't go beyond, let's say, the second year or third year of my life. So all my pleasures and pains and memories, all that traced only to maybe second year or third year. And beyond that, I don't know what happened. And then if I actually look the other way, I don't know what will happen tomorrow or what will happen after this last breath goes out. So then why it is so much of like a misery thinking about all the problems, like how do I serve the society? How do I liberate the society? How do I earn the bread for my family? Like, see, Rishi problem might be like, oh, how do I launch a company? The other Rishi might say like, how do I save this country? Or Sudhakar might say like, oh, how do I become homeless from jobless? Or you can go on describing the problems of each individual, right? But the real crux seems to be, where does this I come from, and how to basically stop that from arising?
Yeah, so I'll again, I'm keeping on drawing analogies from the Bhagavad Gita, but that's because it's such an important text. I think one of the really important questions is life meaningful or not? Is there meaning to life or not? And those who feel there is meaning to life, they will be beset with these questions. There is a fundamental discontent to life. And that is because there is something that is driving us forward. It is beyond the ego. What Arjuna is being told by Krishna is that you have two options here. Either you fight because you are being led to understand what is the meaning of this war and that it is responsible for you to fight here. Or if you don't want to do that and say it is only egoistic, etc., and go to the mountaintop, I will drag you by your own ego into the fight. So there is no escape. Our ego will cause us to do the fight. Or if we get out of the ego, then we will have perception of meaning. And the perception of meaning may tell us that this is exactly what we ought to do. It's no longer the ego. So the question is, I mean, there is some schools that believe there is no meaning to life, but I go by the affirmative view which is being given in the Bhagavad Gita, that life is ultimately meaningful. And that's what, is driving, say, somebody like Rishi Kumar to serve humanity. I mean, it isn't that necessarily that there is a certain kind of an egoistic drive to it, but there is a certain sense of the meaningfulness of life.
Yes, interesting. So some more color from my side. So talking about Bhagavad Gita, so I started reading Bhagavad Gita when I was 12 years old. And I think one term, I mean, if I have to describe, if I only have choice of one word to describe Bhagavad Gita, so that would be Sthit Pragya. So that is the most profound term I found there. And from last 25 years, I've been following Buddha. And the most profound teaching of Buddha, again, if it can be put in one word, that is Sampragyan. So it's interesting that Pragya, Sthit Pragya is there, and Sampragyan, Pragya is also there, right? So that is the profoundness of the wisdom part. So here's my question. So my challenge is that when I was 11 years old, that's the first time I came to know that I was a psychic. And it's been 35 years. And whenever somebody asks me that about any of the paranormal concepts, right, it's impossible to explain it to them. The good part is that in the initial years, people would simply ignore what I'm saying, as much as I try to be quiet about it. Now, because of social standing, people cannot ignore, right? So it kind of becomes interesting that if somebody has a reasonable social status and if that person is talking about the truth, the pseudoscientists, rather than bashing that person, they simply go away. But the question is that, so one is the spiritual knowledge and another is the spiritual experience, right? So given a choice, would you simply stay quiet about it and not talk about it? Remember, even Buddha had this choice. Right after enlightenment, Buddha, when he looked at the people, he decided, you know what, that dharma is so profound and is so nuanced that I don't think that people are ready for it, right? Then the Sampati Brahma, he came down and he said that, yes, people are ignorant, but if you see that veil of ignorance is very thin. So that always becomes a challenge. And with our day-to-day responsibilities and businesses and all those things, that do you focus on yourself and stay quiet, or you also disseminate knowledge, or how do you balance the two? So if you want to maybe give your perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you, Rishi. I think I'd like to first, you started with something very beautiful and profound, which is you distilled the essence of Bhagavad Gita and of Buddha's teaching in terms of Sthita Pragya and Sampragyana. Mm-hmm. And Sthita Pragya, when Buddha talks, when the Gita is talking about, brings up the concept of Sthita Pragya, it's when Arjuna is asking the question, how does the realized person live? How does he walk? How does he talk? What are his external symptoms, right? And he brings up the concept of Sthita Pragya, which, if you want to literally translate it, it could be settled in wisdom, right? And samprajna, as the Buddha is saying, is essentially the same thing, settled, to be settled in wisdom, settled in bodhi. And this is, I mean, I wanted to bring that up because it's essentially the same as what we started with. When we say Brahma Karma Samadhi, this is Brahma Karma Samadhi. Brahma Karma Samadhi is the same as Sthita Pragya. In other words, in your everyday life, in everything that you do, you are settled in perfect equality. You are settled in Brahman. You see, that is the Sthita Pragya. Now, that is not just a mental attitude. That is an integral attitude. The whole being has to participate in it. And if the being is like that, then one receives messages on what to do. This is the whole meaning of Bhagavad Gita. It is not, Krishna is not trying to tell Arjuna, it is ethical for you to go into this battle because your mind will tell you that that is what is to be done, And you yourself pointed out, the Buddha did not go to teach at Sarnath because his mind told him that he ought to go to teach over there. He was in that condition of Sthita Pragya and he got the message. And it is given in different texts differently. Like Indra will come and say that you do that, or he will get an adesh of some kind that this is what you ought to do, right? So if we are available for God's voice, then God will speak to us. You see, that is the whole idea of Sthita Pragya. The Pragya is dynamic, it is coming from moment to moment. It is not something that we have read in a book and which we are looking through a database to find out what the answer is. It's coming right here and now. It is the kartavyam karma, what is to be done just now. So I think, the answer to your question, I'd say is that, certainly it is much more, for me, it is much more worthy to be active in the world, to be an activist in whatever way your spiritual life, your swadharma is driving you to become activist. But the real answer to that is, if one is Sthita Pragya, then what is to be done will come to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings an interesting incident. So my electrician, who's a Caucasian, so one day in the backyard he saw Buddha statue and he was like, Rishi, I thought you are a Hindu, right? And I smiled, right? So I mean, there is no way to explain it. So if somebody asks me that, are you a Hindu or a Buddhist, I say that I arbitrarily say it, but I say that after you have done at least 1,000 hours of meditation, then we will talk about it, right? So because if you do anything less than that, then it's just bookish knowledge, right? So that nuance cannot come. And that also reminds that about Indian traditions and all, right? So that's very different than, there's a lot of value in the Abrahamic traditions.
It's also the issue of spirituality and religion, Rishi. I think there can be spirituality without religion. There can be religion without spirituality. And there can be spirituality with religion. I think the central point is the spiritual aspect. Are we here for experience? Or are we here because some conventions have been given to us to be some label, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, my take is that the coded morality only emerges in the dark ages, right? Because otherwise in the enlightened ages, the people would be skillful enough to understand the nuance of dharma, right? So that's the one. And the other thing is that kind of imposing the whole concept of dharma, right? So what a lot of people do not know is that in all Indian traditions, there was no concept of evangelism. There was the opposite. There was a concept of dharma yachna, right? So if I come to you, Devashish, to learn the dharma, I would plead to you, yachna, right? And even then you can say no. You can say, come to me after 1 year or 5 years, right? And you would only teach me dharma when you think that I am ready for it, right? So that's so different than the whole coded concept of the faith or morality and religion. There is no way the profoundness of Indian spiritual traditions, right? You talked about Bengal Renaissance. I think you should have. I think it started with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
Of course, yeah. If you talk about spirituality in Bengal in the modern period, I think it begins all the way back from the 12th century with Geet Govinda,
Geet Govinda, exactly, yeah.
yeah, and then that tradition really flowers with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the 16th century, and in a way, that fertility of the mystic, soul of Bengal, again flowers with people like Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna. Is really the fountainhead of the Bengal Renaissance, I would say.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I graduated from IIT Delhi, and in IIT Delhi there were two professors. So one professor was Professor P.L. Dhar, who was deep into Vipassana. He was an Acharya of Vipassana at that time. And the another professor was Professor P.V. Krishnan, who was big time into ISKCON, right? So I obviously I tried both the traditions, and it was kind of interesting that in one of the most prestigious institutions you are getting this spiritual knowledge, right? And Krishna also, there was a bias because my last name Yadav, right? But still, I experimented it. In my case, what happened was that all the kind of psychic disturbances I used to get, with Vipassana, that kind of calmed down. So that was kind of a signal which I said, this is the path for me to go for. So those were some more color to it. Sudhakar, you want to resume your questioning?
Like a joke, Rishi, like since you are a psychic, can you tell me like where Corona is sitting and how to avoid it?
so that way I'm a fake psychic. I have somebody who's maybe miles ahead of me. That is Sandhya, and yeah. So she can give more perspective on that. So I'm a kindergartner from that perspective. So.
Yeah, like a joking aside, Devashish ji, like what is your personal sadhana?
My personal sadhana, Sudhakar, is following the yoga of Sri Aurobindo, which is called integral yoga. And in a nutshell, it is what we were discussing. In other words, to what extent can we quiet ourselves to make ourselves available for something deeper to emerge, not merely in experience in meditation. That is important, but also in one's active life. Can I retain that meditative consciousness in my active life? And receive messages. Can I become, you yourself, you were talking about getting the I out of the way. Can I get the I out of the way sufficiently so that I am a channel for the divine? And, people may ask the question, how do you know you're a channel for the divine? You could be a channel for any force, because once you are, open to the inner worlds, or what Rishi was calling the psychic worlds, there are many kinds of leadings, many kinds of voices, there are many kinds of influences that come to us. So how can we purify ourselves so that we become pure channels of the highest voice, of the divine voice? How can we recognize the divine? So these are issues that form the core of what I would call my sadhana.
Like my daughter wanted to ask, since you are a professor connected with the art, spirituality, India, America, and all that, how the art and the power, what's the connection between the two?
Yeah.
How one influences the other?
Yeah, yes. The art, in my life, the art has two places. One is, we were talking about the convergence of the worldly life and the spiritual life. For me, that convergence is a kind of activism. It's academic activism, you may say. And by academic activism, I mean that these things that we are talking about, spirituality or Indian spirituality, has answers to the world, and they're, like what Rishi was saying about Buddha feeling compelled to give some sort of solution. I think today we need to bring these teachings into the world. And I find academics as the venue by which I do that. And so the art history is a vehicle through which the voice of Indian spirituality has spoken and continues to speak. So from that point of view, it is a way by which I can look at the meanings that have gone into what it means, what spirituality means in India. And from a personal point of view, it is the same. It has deepened my own understanding of how the senses can become doors to the divine.
So, so one question I have is, it's kind of getting into slightly the tactical part here, and that is the ether or the akasha element. And so that is the element. So in fact, Calvin and I would discuss it a lot of times, that we wish that the modern science finds the evidence of the ether or the akasha element before we die, right? Because I mean, think about it, the electricity, which in one way can be described as the most gross form of akasha element, that has transformed our lives, right? So during your spiritual journey, I mean, as you know that, I mean, the moment we step foot into it, we encounter this element, anything, anywhere and everywhere, right? So I thought if you want to give some I mean, maybe some perspective on that, based on your decades of spiritual journey, and any wisdom you would like to share with everyone.
So, Rishi, I'd say, I mean, going back to what you're talking about, science discovering akasha or ether of some kind. The problem over there is we may talk about a medium called ether, and I'd say, science has no use or need for it right now, though there have been hypothesized, even Einstein has hypothesized the existence of an ether.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, the problem with all this is that it still remains within the material realm. How can we say that if one, verifies some kind of medium called an ether, that has any bearing on consciousness? I think, see, what Vivekananda was trying to do is actually being realized to some extent in academia right now through things like consciousness studies, so that today we are, or what is called transpersonal psychology, where we are trying to redefine what is psychology. Psychology, it is not just what goes on in the mind. Transpersonal psychology is taking seriously these kinds of experiences of a psychic nature, experiences of a spiritual nature, and experiences of what transpersonal nature, and where are these being had. So even if we look at a broad spectrum of experiences, we'll see that there is a medium, that what you're calling with the word akasha is a Sanskrit term, but this kind of a medium, which is a spiritual medium, astral medium, or even one may say a in-between medium, antariksha, as the Veda calls it, is being talked about in a variety of traditions, as well as in the experiences of people who are trying to reach out for something spiritual. And I think we need a science of that kind. We need a science of the, I mean, there was an attempt to have a science of parapsychology. It was sort of closed down. Today, we don't hear of any parapsych. I mean, in the 70s, it was everywhere. UC Berkeley gave a degree, a PhD degree in parapsychology. Today, they've closed it all down because they thought it was not worthy of being a science. But transpersonal psychology is still alive, and there is an approach to understanding human experience beyond what we can call ordinary human experience, So that's where these concepts will come, because we have to redefine the human.
Yeah, so the challenge is this, right? So in the 3 dimensions and with 5 senses, whether you're talking about science or you're talking about religion or anything else, right? unless you go beyond them, there is no way even science can make progress. Now there are multiple ways to define it. What we call either astral medium, which is obviously the most gross form of it, or the etheric medium, or what scientists call it dark matter or dark energy, right? No matter what you call it, the question is that unless that realization comes, right? And what my understanding and what our understanding is that the only way you get to that is through sound from the physical world, right? Sound is, I won't say the sound is the most efficient way to do it, but I would say sound is the most universal way to do it. That's the reason, the Sudhakar was about to ask a question about the Bij mantras and all, right? Right, Om, Reem, Shim, right, Fat and all those, right? So somehow I think, so I do get your point that it's very difficult for a modern scientist to kind of realize its value. But my counterpoint is that whether they realize its value or not, without that, they cannot make progress. Because even from the scientific terminology, 96% of the matter in the world is the dark matter plus dark energy, right? So also either either the scientists, they can stay with their notions and be happy with 3 to 4% of the universe they understand, right? Or they had to get rid of their notions and get.
Yeah, but Rishi, we can remain kind of obsessively stuck in a definition of the world as a material world.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that obsession cannot kind of keep us there. It's not important. At a certain point, we overpass it in experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who had that view will continue to have that view.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really matter. Just as you were saying, it is not our aim to convert anybody.
Mm-hmm.
It will just become obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
There will be people who will have other kinds of experience. We'll have other ways of describing reality. Reality is not just material.
Mm-hmm.
So either we'll develop new lexicons, new dictionaries, in which we'll expand our knowledge of material science, and some people will pioneer that field, and those who don't want to admit it will remain where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Buddha did have a terminology for it called ehi pashtiko, right? If somebody comes and asks me, he would say, okay, come, sit and experience.
Yeah.
Right? So that was his answer, right? Rather than asking me too many questions, right? This is the technique. You come, sit and experience. Yes, sir.
That is it.
Yes, sir. So before getting into my more questions, I think there is one question which Anjali Srivastav has posted. Anjali, you may want to unmute and ask your question.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite remember the two words, but previously you were both discussing something from the Bhagavad Gita and Buddhism, and Mr. Debashish said something about some type of wisdom, and I was just wondering if he could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I also saw a question about purification, and I will take that up after this, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. The terms were sthita pragya. Sthita pragya is the word from the Gita, and sampragyata or sampragyana. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sampragya is the term that the Buddha is using. It's used in Buddhism, and pragya literally means wisdom. I mean, of course, these are very loaded terms. In the Upanishads, there are jnana. The word jnana is really the root of what in the West is called knowledge. Knowledge is the same Indo-European root. Knowledge in Greek, it's called gnosis, gna. In Sanskrit, it's called jnana. So all of that means the same thing. It means knowledge. And knowledge is not information. Knowledge is not what we are calling knowledge now. In the ancient understanding of knowledge, whether it is Indian or even Greek, the notion of knowledge was knowledge by experience. I know something because I experience it. And so sampragyana or sthita pragya is to reside or be settled in knowledge. In other words, to live in a knowledge consciousness, live in the kind of consciousness in which we can acquire knowledge through experience. There's another famous Upanishad called Prashna Upanishad that is asking the Prashna, the main question of Prashna is, what is that which being known, everything else is known? Is there one thing that I can know? Not learning 2,000 things and feeling I've just scratched the surface. Is there some one thing that I can know by which everything else can be known? That's the question of Prashna Upanishad. That is jnana. So jnana is essential knowledge, knowledge by identity, knowledge by experience. But that is further divided into different kinds of spiritual knowledge. And prajnana is one of those spiritual, it's acquiring knowledge of the inner kind. And so to be settled in a knowledge consciousness, that is samprajnana or sthita pragya, as the Gita uses it. And then the other question regarding purification. What is the meaning of purification so as to be available to the messages of the divine? This was really the question. I think that question it's an interesting question, because I will refer it to Sri Aurobindo himself. And this is Sri Aurobindo was a nationalist. He came from England. He came to India, and he saw the kind of oppression of the colonial people, and he took up activity against them. He started an anti-colonial movement against them. At a certain point, he wanted to know how to be effective in this, how to do, because we are interfering with whatever we have to do. If I want to do something even good, how do I know what is the best way to do it? And the answer was this, how can I be open to the leading of the divine? And to be open to the leading of the divine, we have to first study ourselves, introspect all the many desires that are in us, that are compromising our own intentions. If I want to do something, I'm sort of standing in my own way. I'm getting sort of waylaid by my own desires. So how can I come to a state where I put a kind of a sort of dissolution to those desires, so that I'm a receptive vessel into which truth might come? You see, that is purification. And purification implies having something inside you by whose light you can recognize whether the truth is coming to you or not. That's because the truth already, there is something true, something divine inside us. That is known as the Antaratma, the inner divine, the inner self inside all of us. So how can we come in contact with that and let that radiate in our being, that can actually become a receptacle for the divine? That would be the purification that leads us to receive the leading of the divine.
So, yes, so there is a question from Ashish Khan. Ashish, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, yes.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask one sort of a practical question and maybe another more theoretical.
Yeah.
Let me ask you the practical question, which is
Yeah.
how do you get in touch with your, what
Swadharma.
the Swadharma that you mentioned in the context of Gita.
Yeah. So this is a very profound and very important question, because it relates back to Rishi Kumar's question of how do you lead a spiritual life which converges with a worldly life if one really wants to do it. We start with a lot of fears. We start with fears and desires. Those are our two big impediments. We start with wanting to become somebody because somebody else has told us that we ought to become somebody, right? It's always in terms of some packaged understanding of life. Somebody has given it to us that we need to become a great executive, or we need to become some kind of success story in America or something like that. And the fear that goes with it is, if I don't become like that, then I'll be thought of as a failure. See, so the first thing is, if one is looking for Swadharma, the first thing is one has to have courage to go beyond that. One has to be open to finding the Swadharma. So if the Swadharma tells you what you're supposed to do tomorrow is be a sweeper in the temple, you should have the daring to do that. See, not many people have. So that is the first thing to recognize about wanting to know the Swadharma. Secondly, some people have it easy. They have it from childhood. A great tabla player or a great musician is born into a family of musicians and learns from the very beginning, never even thinks that there is another profession that that person can have, and becomes the best that that person can be. That's an easy way. For most people, it's not like that. We don't know what we want. We are guided into life through a variety of choices that our parents are giving us, our friends are giving us, society is giving us, and our own, kind of what we see in media and all those things are giving us. At a certain point in time, we might want to find what we are really meant to be. What is my Swadharma? What is inside me? The way at that point is to take yourself where you are as you are. You don't need to go anywhere. You need to firstly sit down, really be internal to yourself, be true to yourself, go deep within and make a prayer to whatever you think is the highest divine and say, I give myself to you, lead me. Let me find my Swadharma. One true moment like that sets you on a journey. And if you can do that, then you will find that gradually you are led. You may make mistakes. It's a trial and error process, but something inside you will be guiding you. And one day you'll find that you are where you wanted to be. This is the best answer I can give you, Ashish.
Very nice. Thank you. And it's not exactly a related question, but the way we were brought up in India. I grew up in India. Is the very basic thing about us as a human being is that we are number one, we are divine. Divinity is in us, and the so aham, right? Chirananda so aham, and we are all connected. And this connection gave us that we are the universe. So there have been a lot of articles I've been reading about pantheism and some of the the human, if you can use the term, the human universe, and the scientists are talking about this consciousness as a fundamental particle. Do you see that that the the Vedantic foundation is getting a footing in the overall scheme of things in some of these pantheistic researches?
I think it is. I think a lot of these people are grounding themselves to some extent in Vedantic and Indian teachings, but in many cases, and maybe in most cases, they're not acknowledging it. Which is its own kind of problem. I think it comes to the problem of what is called appropriation. They make it look like it's an invention that came into their minds for the first time. But there is a way by which Indian knowledge is seeping into all of what we are calling the new age. And whether we look at it in terms of these new books that are coming out, or into the new academic disciplines like consciousness studies and transformational psychology or transpersonal psychology, there is a strong input that is coming from these wisdom teachings of India. That comes to what I was saying is, if you may say, my own role as an activist is to establish in academy the ways this profound knowledge can actually lead us forward. What is the what are the solutions to the problems of our time from the viewpoint of consciousness that have actually been experienced and given by this wisdom.
Okay, thank you. Very nice.
So Devashish, one point before giving the control back to Sudhakar is that in one of your interviews, I really like when you talked about the psychic powers, and you said that it's not that psychic powers are discouraged in India, but it's kind of the union of psychic powers along with the other powers, right? So those accomplishments are not bashed, right? In fact, when a lot of people talk about that Buddha was against gaining psychic powers, and that's not true. Buddha was against exhibiting them to lay people and confusing them.
Right.
Right. So that's what he said, because he was like, you just cannot go out and show them off to people. Right.
That's right.
Yeah. So talking about them and I mean, by the common understanding, there are four of them: clairvoyance, clairsentience, clairaudience, and claircognizance. And everybody gets a different combination of that. So when you are guiding folks on the spiritual path, does this question comes between these four powers, right? Which is obviously Divya Chakshu, Divya Shrot, and the rest of them, right? So does that comparison ever come? Folks ask you about guiding in that because a lot of people may say that, we want to improve on them, right? So which is a good thing and which is a bad thing, right? Because if they are doing it at the cost of their spiritual journey, then it's a problem, right? Because these are side alleys, right? But at the same time, they are also a sign of some progress. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, my perspective on that is that in and by themselves, they are not interesting to me, at least. I think, as you mentioned, I think spiritual progress opens up some of these powers. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned four powers, which are the powers of the inner senses. Mm-hmm. There are many other powers. There are the anima, laghima, mahima. Right. Then there is the power, of levitation, uthapana, right? Mm-hmm. There is the power of will, you can get what you want, Aishwarya, Ishita, Vashita, these are all powers. Right. So some of them may open up by themselves if one proceeds or progresses spiritually. Clairvoyance may open up by itself. If one develops a quiet mind, one might start seeing things that one doesn't know about at this point. So I'd say, we were talking about purification, finding the soul within, expanding the consciousness, quieting the mind. If these disciplines, spiritual disciplines, are followed, the other things start developing. And if they start developing, one can focus on them, because that can actually help. You mentioned about sound. The inner sound, the Om is not just a word. Om is the unstruck, anahata nad. It is the unstruck sound. It's going on all the time. This is why the Zen people are talking about the sound of one hand clapping. That is the anahata nad. It is going on all the time. If you hear even a glimpse of it, you can turn your attention on it, and it can become much more powerful. So that's how you develop it, So the development is not just for the sake of development, but for the sake of increasing the spiritual life.
Yeah, absolutely. So some adding some more color to it. So whenever people talk about the past life regression, most of the people are I was this king, or I was that king, or I was this warrior or that warrior. So in my case, I did it a few times, and the one time, what I found was that in my past life I was a water buffalo. Now it's not like I'm being an entrepreneur. I could say, how come I was not a king? But the most interesting part is this: when I sat in that, in that consciousness, I could see a lot of my childhood challenges getting resolved. Right? There were a lot of childhood conflicts, and I was like, wow, this thing is flowing so smoothly, right? And that is also a sign that was I just visualizing something, right? Or was it something reality, right? But you're right that
it's actually very profound. What you just said has to do with the transpersonal psychology, because, in a way, it's not just our environment that is making us who we are. It's a lot of influences from past lives, from lives around us that are occult. And one can come into contact with these things, with influences and personalities that are coming from outside, and one can actually heal through that connection. That is its real purpose, I think. That is why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Sudhakar?
Rishi, I had two comments for the previous two questions and then a question. So the last question you had was about the powers, right? When this topic came, the Buddha said the greatest power he has is in his words, where he's explaining something and then it is actually liberating the people. For example, in the Aditya Pariyaya Sutta, is giving a short discourse of 15 minutes and there is a 1250 people become arhants. So that is the true power. That's the comment first. The other comment was about the swadharma. So in Buddha's teaching, we have this concept which is dhammanupashana, meaning whatever arises in the mind is called dharma. That is one of the meanings of the dharma. So when we say swadharma, means like what arises in your mind constantly versus some other thought that you see, but it may be very fantastic that you see Steve Jobs and you want to be like him, right? But your mind doesn't operate the way Steve Jobs' mind, right? So your mind thinks about the money, how do I make money? Okay, consulting or this or that. So you have to go with what is arising in your mind and let it translate into actions, of course, within the ethical framework. That's the second comment. My real question to Debashish is, I hear this in the literature that in the Kundalini, there are chakras and the lotuses, and the Kundalini is like a snake. So all these snake, lotuses, all these are metaphors or are actually they are real physical sensations that you experience in that way. And related to that, the second part of the question is that when you chant these bija mantras, that is like you are trying to utilize verbalization to get to the bodily experience. Will that work? And the third part of the same question is when you try to visualize lotuses, is it just an aid to locate the part of the body and then eventually you get to the sensation of the body, or is it something else? So if you could comment on those, I would appreciate.
Yes. These are very profound questions. And, through many centuries in India, we have utilized these symbols, because there is a language. It's almost like a coded language of symbolism that has given us access to certain kinds of experiences. And some people will tell you that these are exactly what the occult images are that you see. My own understanding of this is that they are significant approximations. They're utilizing a certain lexicon of vocabulary of nature that is bringing us into close contact with the kinds of movements and forms that we may experience. You see, now other cultures may have other images for the same thing. For example, the dragon. In China, from a very early period, they have conceptualized a Kundalini kind of energy of the earth as a dragon. And it's that same dragon and the rising of the dragon up the spine, which they see as the kind of movement that we call Kundalini action. See? Similarly, when we are talking about chakras as lotuses, lotuses is a very, helpful image and very image which you see, because nature has its own symbolism. Nature is already operating on various registers of symbols, and these symbols are all approximating similar functions, you see. So a certain kind of a symbol is really going to bring us close to a certain unspoken function which otherwise we would not be able to get to. So these are, and once these symbols are repeated by many, many people, they develop a certain kind of reality. And that reality is almost like identical with what is going to be experienced. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is just that, you see. So that is how it is. It's like two different languages, one which cannot be talked about and one which is an approximation of the other, that are being conflated, you see. And coming to the bija mantras, it's similar. Bija mantras are significant vibrations. Each one is a vibration that is related to some of these chakras or some of these combinations of experiences. And it is this that is opened up when one allows that vibration to repeat in oneself. In fact, a bija mantra, if you repeat it, at a certain point, it falls silent. You don't repeat it with your mouth anymore. It becomes a pure vibration inside your consciousness. You just feel it as a vibration at that point.
Yeah, that's very profound, because Bij mantra or any kind of a mantra, the actual power of mantra is the gap, the silence between those mantras, right? That is the first thing which we learn as we go deeper into it, right? It's the power of that vacuum.
Yeah,
which is,
and then it's the form, it's a kind of a sound form, sound image, which is behind the actual sound.
Absolutely. So Preeti has a question. Preeti, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sean, name us.
I think
Rishi,
there's some unmuted voice that is coming.
Let me, I think.
yeah, folks who are not speaking can mute themselves. That would be beneficial for everybody.
Now it's good, yeah.
Okay. So Rishi, my question was actually to you. You had talked about your past life regression, and
I'm not the guest, by the way, but yeah.
Yeah.
I will not go deeper into it, but yeah, we can.
So my question to you is that you said you sat with it, and could you just elaborate on that piece? And each time I've done a couple of times also past life regression, and one time, and both of them were like, I'm a guy, and one I just saw the back, like a Indian village guy, and the second time was a more like a savage person, leader type of a situation. And I haven't really sat with those, whether it's a feeling, whether whatever it may be, or images that forms, when you're trying to do past life regression. So talk to me a little bit more about how
I can. Yes, so
resolve your.
Yes, so I can add some more color before and then give it to Devashish. So the biggest challenge in those kind of things is, and Devashish did bring it up, that anything which has got to do with any of the parapsychology, the challenge is that you have to get the signal out of the noise, and that's where obviously you need adapt the region. They are better at it, so you get better at it with time. In my case, it was so clear because I was able to connect the tendencies at that time to the tendencies of my childhood, right? So another topic, another day. But
right.
So in my case, there was zero doubt that it was my mental projection, right? But otherwise, how do you figure out whether it's a mental projection or not? Devashish, if you want to throw some light on it.
Yeah, this is actually a very large subject, and it has to do with the whole world of inner experience. People jump so easily into thinking that something is a past life. It may be many other things. In my school, it's very popular now for people to go to Peru and have experiences of ayahuasca. You know, there are
Somras.
shamans there.
Somras,
Right.
that's what a lot of people call that. That's actually
Yeah,
Somras, yeah.
then you get into an altered state of consciousness, and you see all kinds of images, visions, and they come back and they describe them and say that that was their past life.
Mhm.
Now, how can you be sure that that was a past life? And I think what Rishi is saying is very true. Only you can know by your own datum of developing a certain kind of verification system as to what it really means. It could just be fantasy. It could also be something true that is coming from a past life, but not the life of your soul. I mean, we are really recycled materials. You know,
Right.
we are, our physical body is taking shape in this life, but inside it, the consciousness is all kinds of formations, what the Buddhists called samskaras. Samskaras don't even necessarily belong to you. You've picked them up from somewhere inside, and it may be attached to somebody else's life. And, you know, we can have experiences of all kinds. So the point is, one has to really turn this into a subjective science for oneself to parse out what inner experiences mean to one.
Absolutely. So yeah, as I said that. So in my case, I mean, there was this wow element when that happened, right? So because it was going so smoothly and it kind of resolved so many challenges which I had in my early childhood. So without that measure, I have absolutely no idea that there was any way for me to tell. Right. The tricky part was that if I had to speculate, I would have speculated like everybody else that, you know, king or warrior. That's what most of the people are, right? If they have to make a choice. But obviously, everybody could not be a king or a warrior in past life. Think about it, right? So there had to be regular people also.
Thank you. Thank you, Rishi. I have another question for Debashish, if it's okay to ask.
Yes,
If I may
sure.
ask.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rishi. So, Debashish, my question to you is that um, at any given moment of time, how do we accept the inner conflict and become in peace with it? Because I don't know about others, but Rishi knows me, and I've been meditating for a while, and most days are good days, and life is really blessed for all of us here. But in recent times, or some days, you know, when there's an inner conflict about doing the right things, or am I doing the right things? Is it the right thing? Or I want to do the right thing, but I'm not doing the right thing. So all these inner conflicts that really causes or creates chaos. What's a better way to kind of sit within it, or let it pass through, or how to deal with it in your thinking?
So, you know, there's many answers to that question, and it really depends on the individual and also on the faith of the individual. So, for example, you know, depending on if one wants to utilize a certain kind of a non-theistic approach. In other words, today it's kind of, I mean, many people find it difficult to believe in God, so to say. So they find exercises of consciousness to actually quiet the mind or bring the mind into some kind of receptive state and look within for an answer. And that's if one can do that, that's great. But you know, I started by talking about the Bhagavad Gita, and for me, Bhagavad Gita is the solution. It gives solutions to everything, really. And Bhagavad Gita is a theistic text. We have to first come to terms with that there is a God in Bhagavad Gita. His name is Krishna, and we may or may not believe in Krishna, but certainly if there is a transcendental divine, which is not dualistic, in other words, the divine is not different from you, but the divine is a part of you that you are no longer in connection with. And so that part of you which is transcendental, which is universal, which knows everything, which is all wise, you can offer whatever you have, gather yourself and offer everything to that part. You know, you have to, in your meditation, that's an aspect of meditation according to the Bhagavad Gita. It is not just making the mind quiet or sitting. You see, Buddhism will tell you vipassana, you know, that you have to have insight. You have to know that everything is empty, that there is nothing true that is substantial, etc. It doesn't help everybody. It doesn't help everybody because there are problems that will not go away so easily in thinking that they don't exist. And the Gita's approach there is to gather the problem and offer it to the highest being that you know that you are, as well as that is the whole transcendent being, and ask for an answer over there. If one does that repeatedly, there is a moment when one feels one's problem has been taken. You know, one has managed to give one's problem, and then it isn't necessarily that something will come to you. A certain kind of peace will come, and certain kind of steps will unfold. They'll unfold partly through trial and error, and partly through receptivity. The more quiet you become, the more it is as if somebody is guiding you. You will feel the presence of a guidance. That is the kind of meditation that I feel is most effective.
Yeah, so Devashish, I think, I mean, you put a great point, right? So in fact, whether you look at Buddha or Krishna, when they were guiding, they were not guiding for the future generations. They were there in the present moment. And they were guiding that. So Krishna was obviously in a war scene, right?
Yeah.
So his goal was to maximize the impact on Arjun rather than thinking that how it's going to be translated. In case of Buddha also, right? So Buddha, not only Vipassana, Buddha gave 40 meditation objects. In fact,
Sure.
there was one person who came to Buddha and asked for guidance. So Buddha said, okay, why don't you imagine a golden lotus and focus on that? And then some other disciples asked him that, why did you give him that? So he said, because this guy was a goldsmith from last many, many lives, right? So he had that attachment. So you're exactly right. So again, it goes to the point of spirituality versus religion, right?
Right.
Yeah. So these things are, so if whether it's Buddha or Krishna, if somebody goes in front of them, they would look at them and then decide what is the right medicine for that person.
Yeah.
Right. But so the challenge between now is that we do have a spiritual renaissance now, and but there were these dark ages in between, which was almost of 2000 years, right? So that created a lot of confusion between how the spirituality was, how it were, and how it got perceived during dark ages, right? Because the dark ages, even sound was not enough, right? So dark ages, you had to put additional effort for people to make even one step progress on the path of dharma, right? While in the Satyuga, right, they say you don't even have to talk, right? You can just feel it, right? So those were my 2 cents on it, Sudhakar.
How much time do we have?
So I think, unless typically our podcasts go for 2 hours at least. So unless Devashish had a hard stop. So.
Okay. So we are using the psychic powers, also known as Zoom and Skype, to interact with the people far away. Earlier, we had the limited intelligence, that is to basically make a combustible engine or steam engine or things like that, where you are substituting the work of hands and legs, right? So now we have a substitute for the brain and all that. So now this artificial intelligence, will that actually make the substitute for a human being, or where will it go?
Yeah, I think you are touching on something really important, Sudhakar, and that's particularly germane to us here. Most of you are in technology field, and people come to America because technology in Silicon Valley is really the kind of heart of the world of technology today. And it's a place that is creating wonders, marvels. And the question is, how does that relate to all that we are talking about? And I think I'd like to relate it also to this issue of the dark ages that Rishi was talking about. The word dark ages is technically used, technically speaking, in academia, it's used for the period before the Renaissance. It's the dark ages of Christianity. And they're called the dark ages because, and by whom is it called dark ages? It's called dark ages by our modern age. It's called dark age because it was an age of superstition. And it was an age of irrationality. And it was an age of hierarchy. Some people thought that they had the truth while the others didn't. They just put themselves on top of those people and forced them to do what they wanted. So the Enlightenment, on the other hand, is again a technical term. It's a technical term that is born in the West, and it's born in the 17th century. And it's also the birth of the age of science and technology, because it thinks that it is enlightened from the dark ages, because that was an age of superstition. Now we are going to trust on reason, not superstition. It was an age of hierarchy, and now we are going to trust in the equality of all beings because everybody has got the same faculty called reason, And so that is the age that has been with us over the last 500 years. And today, that has yielded, it's almost like a kind of a sort of a climax point. It has almost come to a point where we know enough about the world that we can create the devices by which we can have a kind of materialized godhood. Think about it. What are the properties of God? Omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. We are, to some extent, in a certain way, omnipresent today, because each of us can just take the cell phone and get to any point on earth just by pressing a button, right? We are omnipotent. We can actually have remote control over objects and things anywhere wirelessly, right? We are omniscient. We can actually get knowledge from any encyclopedia that we want at any time. You see? So in a way, we have a certain kind of godhood. We have the godhood of Western enlightenment that we have arrived at today. But is that the same as what we mean by spiritual godhood? This is a question. And is there a relationship between the two? I think it's a really very profound question. I don't think it is the same. It is certainly not the same. We have not become Buddha. We have not become Krishna. We have not become Ramakrishna or Sri Aurobindo. We have just become human beings with technological capacity. You see, we have just increased. We have just increased our ability to punch buttons. That's all that we've done. We haven't even increased in our brain capacity. You see, we have just put our minds together to create machines. You see, so, but there's something quite marvelous about those machines. What is marvelous about the machines is that we've materialized a kind of universal mind. We have materialized a kind of universal mind. The internet right now is a kind of extra individual universal mind that we can tap into in a certain way. We have exteriorized our minds into a certain kind of universal mind. And that is dangerous as well as promising. It's got both sides to it. It's dangerous because we can be conditioned today much easier than we were yesterday. Very easily people are conditioned today. Advertising can force us to do what it wants. Politics can force us to do what it wants. Religion can force us to do what it wants. See, we don't even think about it. But at the same time, if we know what we want, we can use this medium to get a lot that we could never get yesterday. You see? So it's something very powerful. At the same time, we have to realize that our consciousness has been dwarfed by it. And it's really a different kind of godhood, a different kind of enlightenment that we have to move towards if we are to not be just apes in a rocket, You put an ape into a rocket with lots of buttons and they manage to blow up the rocket, you see. So how can we be equal to the capacity that we've unleashed? See, it's spirituality that we need to move towards to even be equal to our mental capacity today.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great analogy between the universal mind and the internet. And internet has the good, bad, ugly of it, and the same thing happens when you get to even the psychic realms, right? And like internet, the bad always get attracted to you first,
Yeah.
right? So when I was talking about dark ages, I was talking it in a loose sense, not in the most Western sense.
Sure. I know.
Yeah. So one thing which actually, so when I watched Sadhguru's video about this cycles of yuga, that is the revolution which takes 25,920 years, at least for 10 years before that, while in deep meditation, I was getting this feeling that there is a pattern to it. There is something which increases. Again, you can call it Akash, you can call it ether, which increases, and then suddenly all these great minds are born, right? Einsteins of the world, the Newtons of the world, and all these great discoveries happen, right? I could feel that pattern. And when I saw this thing about that, that all these four yugas, right? So Satyuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, and Kali Yuga, right? And so when the theory came, and in my case, it's kind of interesting that for a lot of things, my experience came first, and then came the theory, right? Which kind of probably should be the right way to do things, right? But the point is, until the theory comes, you're very confused, right?
True.
So I was talking about that part, that the dark ages of what was called Kali Yuga, right?
Yeah.
That was, and you are right that we are just scratching the surface when if you talk about going to the heights which we were at one point of time. Lalit had a question. Lalit, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, hi, Debashis. Hey, thanks for the great information you're sharing. You were referring to a Upanishad which was talking about how to maintain our state, being aware that we are the divine fragment or Antaratma, and also the other side of it, and yet being in the same place. What was that Upanishad, and can you tell a little bit more and about it?
Yeah, that was the Isha Upanishad, Lalit. And Isha Upanishad is a very profound Upanishad. It's one of the small Upanishads. It's got only 18 verses in it. And, you can look at it. I have written a book on it. It's called Meditations on the Isha Upanishad. What it's saying is that there are two ways to go for spirituality, even spirituality. One is escape from life. In other words, if we leave everything and go completely out, we will come to something in which we see the world is a dream, the world is illusion, and something else is there which is permanent. Then if we do that, then we've come into contact with a transcendental eternity. Okay? But we've lost the world. On the other hand, if we take the world as real, then we either get lost in the world, or we can find some divinity in the world, which is deep inside us. It is the reincarnating element inside us. And we find another kind of eternity, which is the eternity of becoming, the eternity of reincarnating soul. See? Now, what the Isha Upanishad is saying is that these are two kinds of spirituality, and you can broaden this idea. It's a very important idea. Today, we are in a world in which different cultures are clashing. You see, each of these cultures has its own idea of spirituality. They have developed their own religions. They've developed their own methods of approaching the divine. They've developed their own experiences of the divine. And each one thinks that that's either the only one and everybody else is wrong, or they think that's the best one. The other ones exist, but they are lower than one's own. You see? So the question is, why does that happen? That happens because of the mind. The mind has a principle in it which is called the principle of the excluded middle. Those who've studied logic know this. The law of the excluded middle means that if A is true, not A cannot be true. See, if Advaita Vedanta is true, no other experience of God can be true. If that God is Christ is true, then no other definition of God can be true. The mind holds that to be the case. But there can be a kind of experience that transcends the mind, not only transcends it in a way that goes completely outside it, but can show the mind its own source. And that is not the kind of, faculty that we use ourselves at this point. It's only in contact with that faculty that one can have different kinds of spiritual experiences and know them to be different descriptions of the same. You see, that is what that Upanishad is talking about.
Yeah, very fascinating. Yeah. Something to start working on today. Yeah, thank you.
So let's bring it back. I think we have been having a really, really good discussion, and we can keep going. We planned for an hour. We are already 40 minutes past that, but really nice to have you, Debashish. So let's bring it around with a little bit more like a very sort of a question that is about this real world that we operate in. We were at a spiritual plane, and I really enjoyed that learning. But my question is about, if you look at the current state, when we look at Indian Americans and how they basically abhor everything, which is Indian or spirituality, or even things like astrology or Ayurveda, things that I believe are proven to an extent. And there is a lot of value in terms of the mathematics, and there is a fundamental science associated with them. And but I think it's become fashionable to sort of slam it or claim a different allegiance. Any comments on that, Debashish?
Yes, Rishi. So you're talking about the prevalent sense of materialism, right? You're talking about how even Indians in the West kind of trash the entire spiritual tradition. This is what you're talking about, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. And, partly it comes, see, it's a very profound point, because partly it is the way our age is. Our age is a materialistic age. So those who get educated, those who bite the bullet, who kind of really drink the Kool-Aid of Western knowledge, they to some extent become inculcated into the idea of a materialistic world, scientific world. What's really interesting is that Sri Aurobindo, who became a great yogi, his father was of this kind. This has been going on for a long time. So his father was what's called an Anglophile. When he sent his sons to study in England. When he sent his sons to study in England, he told the caretaker, don't let these people meet any Indians, because they'll get their, ideas all mixed up. We want to be good Englishmen, you see. So there is one kind of Indian like that. They don't even want to look at their own tradition because they think that it is not modern, And then there is another kind that sort of feels inferior and feels that we have to cling to our religion. There is a kind of clinging to religion, that we shouldn't question anything. We shouldn't look at the West, or we should look at the West only for making a living, but all the answers are found in our religion. See, I think what has to happen is that today the leading thinkers of the West are seeing that they don't have solutions. This is what has brought us to the COVID world, actually. The COVID world is really a world of dysfunction. It's a world in which ecological biodiversity has been bankrupted. The climate is going haywire, chaotic. We are not being able to control our finances. In every way, cultures are warring with each other. We are in a dystopic world. Only those people who have some comfort think that there is nothing wrong with the world. But even as we are talking, you're talking about holding meetings for those people who have become unemployed. More and more people are becoming unemployed due to events that we have created for ourselves, because we don't really have the solutions. So the question is, how can we find those solutions? Those solutions have to be found not by addressing a false view of the world, nor by clinging to an old view of the world, but by addressing a true view of the world in our times. And that is exactly where spirituality has to be engaged to give us new models for living. And, the people who think that they can just bash the entire past and be fashionable Westerners, they are backing the wrong horse, because that horse is not going to run very long.
Yep, very true, very true. And no matter which way we look at it is, I think if you look at the number of people who are converging to some sort of a spiritual belief during this shelter in place over the last 2 to 3 months, it's a phenomenal number. And it's perhaps a shift that was really intended for the world to lead us into a better world. It's going to be a new world, a radically new world, which is going to be a lot different compared to what we left behind. But I think there was a reason why we sort of we are going through this evolution, the morphing, and the impact that we're all feeling. And we are feeling it not only in our minds, but also in our hearts. Because the very first week, if I look at when we went into a lockdown and the students were back home, I could see how the angst was building up with all the comments, the emails that I was getting. People were so anxious. And there is a reason why, because that morphing has to happen. And clearly having some sort of a spiritual path, reading books, perhaps books that have been written by Debashish, will put us on track. And just internally doing some soul searching and making the right choice. And what is the right choice? Been there to be there to help mankind, to be there for our neighbors. And we have sort of fallen off that mindset. We have operated in a world which is inherently very selfish driven. In fact, I was at a high school panel discussion today, and we were talking about how we need to adopt a little bit of a social net in terms of what our capitalistic beliefs are, to make sure that we can create a future for every American. We need to carve out a new course, and it's coronavirus that is basically providing us those insights and that morphing the change, the transformation that will eventually happen. I don't think so we have seen it yet, because as we sort of go through this journey, those mind shifts will happen, and we'll continue to read and get inspired by Debashish in terms of the books he has written, and we'll continue to have conversations with Debashish and many of you who have a clear spiritual path based on the discussions I heard today. So with that, I really appreciate Debashish for spending a time with us. We went 45 minutes over time, but it was very productive. This video will be there on YouTube for our folks to watch again and again. We were live transmitting on Facebook also. So thank you all for joining in and participating in a very active discussion. And thank you all the wisdom you shared today, Debashish.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Rishi, and thanks for all the great discussions initiated by Rishi and Sudhakar. I look forward to getting to know all of you much better in the future.
Yes, absolutely. We have to thank Sudhakar, Reddy, and also Rishi Yadav, and many of our folks who joined in to make this an actively engaged dialogue. Rishi, any final word from you?
No, I think it was absolutely engaging, and this is I always believe in the power of long form conversations. Only this week the world came to know about the power of it when Joe Rogan got supposedly over $200 million deal from Spotify, right? Because any intellectual conversation needs to be a long form conversation. It cannot be a CNN style 30-second back and forth type of conversation. And Rishi Kumar, we are so grateful that he's facilitating all these conversations, right? The last point I would make from my side here is this, that
Rishi, Preeti had a question also. So after you finish, let's take up Preeti's question.
So Debashish, there is a concept of, so Buddha talked about three things, Dukh, Anitya, and Anatma. So Anatma, the concept of non-self, which is exactly the mirror of the concept of Aham Brahmasmi, or the non-duality and Advait, right? If you flip the coin, right? So I think that itself should probably take 2 to 3 hours from our side, and probably we should take that as one of the topics also. Yeah, so Preeti can ask her question.
No, if you allow me, Rishi, just a moment, because this is a really important theme. People have grappled with this for a long time. I've been writing a sociology of Indian spirituality. I'm working on that right now. In the Buddha's earliest texts, in the Pali canons, in the earliest texts, this entire notion of anatta comes from the second sermon of the Buddha. And in the second sermon of the Buddha is talking about the 5 skandhas, which are the five constituents of phenomenal experience, how we experience phenomena. And each one of them he is pointing to, and he's saying, "Oh bhikkhus, do you think that this is an Atman?" And they are saying, "No, this is not an Atman," which already implies the definition of the Atman as a permanent self, right? So none of the constituents of phenomenal experience, which is temporal, can be the permanent self. The permanent self, if it exists at all, has to be outside of phenomenal experience. This is what the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is also saying. So where is the difference? I think the problem comes later when people make a metaphysics out of it and say the Buddha said there is no Atman. The Buddha nowhere said there is no Atman.
Yeah,
the Buddha
absolutely.
just said that the constituents of phenomenal experience have no Atman. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. So both, like, so they say Buddha said there is no Atma and there is no Paramatma, right? Now the question is that this logic could only hold true again in those dark ages, right? Because what Buddha, as you already described, the Atma part, but even Paramatma part, right? Buddha said, Devas, yes, Indra comes and talks to me, Brahma comes and talks to me, right? But there is no Paramatma the way you think about it. That was his answer.
Exactly, because that is outside of phenomenal experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So his point was that he talked about 31 lokas, right?
Yeah.
Right? So I mean, he talked about 16 types of just Brahma lokas. He said all of them exist and they come and talk to me. Right?
Exactly.
But the Paramatma, the way you know it.
Yeah.
Or you think of it.
You think of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't exist.
It cannot come into your thought because it's the subject. Everything else is object.
Exactly.
You know? Even our thinking is object.
Yeah. So that's something. So I mean, even the different spiritual traditions of India, the difference I think could only last during dark ages, right? Again, I'm using a loose sense.
Yeah, this is the time when we have to go beyond all that. Yeah, we have to solve these problems today. Yeah, true. Yeah.
Okay, Preeti, you can ask your question now.
It was a very enlightening discussion. And my questions are, I'm sorry to take you back and kind of going back into the practicality of, how we live our lives. So one school of thought is that just give unconditionally, and that cycle of karma, right? If you keep giving and you feel good about giving, doesn't matter whether you're giving money or your services or just being present and listening unconditionally or fully present. So what do you think about that thought? And second one was around, when you sometimes, I feel it now that it's like I'm stuck in this loop, Black Hawk Day type of a situation. Get up and then, you're cooking and cleaning and it's just like that same loop. And how do you either break free from that, or you are in so much of acceptance that you don't feel that it's a loop? So two different questions, very practical. And sorry to take you out into the practical side versus the lot more spiritual side.
So, well, the first question about giving unconditionally. Okay, so whereas you may say that that there is, in the Gita we talk about the gunas. That the gunas are various modalities of nature, and they're saying that there are 3 principal modalities of nature. They are related to the 3 kinds of nature force that exists, matter force, life force, and mind force.
Mm-hmm.
So material force is inertial, so there is a certain guna, quality of nature that is inertial. That's called tamas. Then there is life force. Life force is dynamic. It's proliferating, becoming more complex, moving, changing all the time. So that nature force is called rajas. And mind force is kind of something which has got more light and luminosity to it, intelligence to it, and that is called sattva. So this idea of doing good, of doing giving, etc., is a amplification of what is called sattva.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sattvic life. And Gita is saying we must increase our sattva. We have to increase the sattva, because the more we are trapped in the tamasic and the rajasic life, the less available we are to the higher life, the higher calling. But spirituality does not even begin at that point. Spirituality is about going beyond the three gunas. It's called
Mm-hmm.
three guna tita. You have to go beyond the three gunas. The point about doing good, it's always good to do good, but it is also a kind of ego. It's the altruistic ego, the sattvic ego. It gives one a certain kind of, fattening of one's self-esteem. I'm doing good. And what happens with that is that in a way that you are developing a certain kind of karma, true, a good karma, but you are not actually being able to experience that which is beyond the three gunas, beyond nature itself, that which makes you divine. What is the true divinity in you? So from that point of view, it is good, but it is not enough. If you want to make a distinction
Mm-hmm.
between morality or ethics and spirituality, you see, there's a
Right.
distinction between the two. And then to answer your other question, it's also a very important question. It's a question about people who find that they are caught into a circle of routine every day. I would say the first thing in approaching that is to keep some time, maybe in the morning and at night, where you can distance yourself from that routine, where you can sit and be only with yourself and with the divine, so that one can actually have a sense that there is something in you that is not caught by that routine, that is totally free of that routine. That part in you which is free of that routine is truly eternal, because that can actually feel time in a completely different way. If you have a taste of that sense of expansion in time, then for one at least, your feeling of being trapped in the routine can be impacted by that. You can feel very different. You can start feeling that same routine to be a unpredictable, creative life. And it doesn't mean that you will actually stay like that all the time. Something new may open up for you. You don't know. So to be open to the possibility that we are not going to remain who we are, but something is changing in us and there's something eternal that can impact our everyday life. I think to have a taste of that experience is really important.
Yeah, I totally believe in that actually. So thank you for reminding me. Appreciate it.
All right. So any final words of wisdom from folks?
Any last words?
Yes. All right. Good.
I want to take a moment to thank you, Rishi Kumar, from bottom of my heart, from organizing these wonderful conversations. I think this is really, really important, especially in these times. Rishi, can't thank you enough. You're doing such a phenomenal job, and keep at it. And again, thank you.
Yeah, it's not just making lemonade, right? It's making like a spicy lemonade, right? The lemon of
No, it's like lemon cake.
yeah, lemon.
Making
Good. Well said, Preeti. And I really appreciate you joining in and for always supportive and being very kind to my efforts. And as a public, as a community leader, it's very easy for folks to take pot shots at us, but seemingly it strengthens me every time it happens. So, but kind words are always welcome, and they sort of bolster my spirits for sure. So Debashish, thank you so much again. Thank you, Rishi Yadav, Sudhakar Reddy. Thank you so much for moderating and asking all these wonderful questions that channeled us into a really good direction. I'll tell you what, I have to watch this video again because there's a lot of reading, listening that we all need to do. So I'll be watching this one more time. And thank you, Sandhya, as well, for joining in. And everybody, enjoy the rest of the Memorial Day weekend. Have a good one.
Wish you Rishi Kumar to be the new Janaka Maharaj.
Agree.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We are all with you, Rishi, to party in November.
November 3rd is the big election night victory party. So please join in.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.